really discouraged the team to talk about IPO at all. All we talked about in the company was what we called PCR, which now has a different meaning because of COVID. But PCR for us was public company readiness. And we said, hey, we need to be public company ready, to the point where I would say about a year before we were actually going public, that became a company priority.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to CFO Talks. Today, I'm extremely excited to be speaking with Allen Shim, who was CFO at the app that every modern worker loves using, Slack. Allen joined Slack during its early stages as employee number 20, and more recently served as its CFO for 3 years. During that time, he played an instrumental role in shaping the company's growth, from building out the finance and operation functions to leading its direct listing, and finally overseeing its acquisition by Salesforce for a record-breaking $27 billion. I'm super excited to have him on the show, and it's also our first in-person recording. Welcome, Allen, and it's great to have you at Aspire's office in Singapore. Would be really keen to understand where you started from, what you did in college, and then take us through from there.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. For me, and I'm a parent of immigrants, Korean immigrants in the US. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not local to Singapore. I grew up in Long Island, New York, and went to school at Penn Wharton. And so I got my start in the business side of things. So I did financial services coming out of college for 2.5 years or so. But then I moved to California to take my first tech job, Yahoo. That really introduced me to the tech scene and the internet economy, and just what it was like to build companies, which I think is pretty different than analyzing them from a financial perspective. I joined Yahoo in 2005, so it was one of the major internet players at that time. This is really before Google totally dominated search or Facebook really even arrived on the scene. So it's a very different time. And I was very bullish on, obviously, the internet at that point. But I think for me, Yahoo was already quite a large company, as you were kind of mentioning. It was about 6,000 employees when I joined. And within a 3-year period, it grew to 15,000 employees. That's just one measure of kind of growth. And it was probably too fast, to be honest, for a company of that size. And you could feel the growing pains. And I think what I learned from it, though, was on the one hand, here's what it looks like to operate at scale, but there's also a lot of mistakes I saw being made along the way, or at least improvements I thought that could be easy to achieve if it had taken a different approach. And so that was sort of pointing me to the startup scene where I was like, okay, now I've seen it done a different way. Maybe I can do it a way that I think could be done better, albeit at a much smaller scale. And so quickly from there, I really got the bug, if you will, and went to my first startup called Yumi, which is a video advertising company. And I joined there as a relatively early employee. It was 30 some odd people then, and wanted to experience the journey from that very early stage, what it was like to build something. And thankfully, we were able to take that public, a small cap IPO. After that, I realized, wow, going public was quite difficult. So from there, I then joined Slack, and Slack is really a rich journey that I can tell you more about as well.
Got it. And when you were doing finance in UPenn, did you know you wanted to get into tech, or what brought you to tech?
I had no real understanding of tech when I was in university. I was in business school, and all everyone really thought about was investment banking or consulting or equity research or that kind of thing. And so I chose the path of equity research and put my time in New York and in that kind of Wall Street environment. And it just so happened that some friends of mine who were ex-bankers, ex-private equity, had made this move from New York to California. And one thing led to another where I caught up with one of my friends, and an opportunity arose for me to make a similar move to Yahoo. And so the rest is kind of history. I think it was just an openness to what was happening there, thinking that I could use a change of pace and really a change of culture, a work culture. And so that really happy it worked out. But I didn't give it that much thought versus being open to change.
That's really cool. And I'm really interested in sort of these transition opportunities that you've been exposed to. And from Yahoo, you went to Yumi, and how many years was that? Can you give me a short sort of summary? It sounds like you were there through the IPO as well.
So I was at Yahoo for 3.5, 4-ish years. And then I went to Yumi, and I was there for 5.5 years. So when I joined, it was quite small. And then, we went public, and about 6 or 9 months after we went public is when I joined Slack. And I was at Slack for 7.5 years. And I joined there when it was a 20-person company. So to me, it's actually one of the things I started learning in life was when I was younger, I just would switch jobs, or at least I always felt like I had this need to switch jobs because I was never satisfied with the rate I was being promoted at, or, that I wasn't being recognized and given a higher title and pay sooner. And it's funny because when I came from the financial services world where, money was everything, money was the measure of how you were performing, to a corporate world where, the average raise was, 3% or 4%, in a normal year, in a bonus, in a good year where you got promoted was kind of 10%. Just didn't compute for me because of the way I used to think. And now, having matured a bit, I've learned so much by actually resisting some of those tendencies on some level, growing up from them, to, build experience, build relationships. Most importantly, these specific environments where I can learn from the right people in the right place.
Yeah. And I guess you've been fortunate in those decisions that you've made. In the startup world, not every startup works out, right? But you've managed to stay in for long periods at these startups. A bit about Slack, like how did you get that opportunity to join so early? Did you know it was going to be big? What attracted you to join?
The easiest way to talk about Slack is to understand a little bit more about Yumi. So when I joined Yumi, as I mentioned, I was quite early and kind of saw this early stage of growth where we're effectively kind of just starting to generate revenue and then helping that scale to kind of a couple $100 million in revenue. But along the way, there's a lot of steps to take to get to that point, right? And that's probably an understatement. But the experience there was very formative for me. And on some level, I learned more because I made a lot of mistakes. And I was given both the freedom to do that and also was able to quickly adapt from them and learn and see when I had made a bad judgment call. When I got to Slack, or when that came into the picture, Yumi had been public about 2 or 3 quarters at that point. And the life of a public company, particularly at that size and scale, was very challenging for us. I think we understood what it meant to go public, but not what it meant to be a public company. And the analogy I like to share all the time is it's like a wedding is different than marriage, right? Wedding is cool and exciting and fun, and marriage is long-term and can be, a lot of challenges as well. A lot of blessings and amazing parts as well, but also it has a share of challenges. And I think we underestimated the marriage element of that being a public company. So at that point, I was considering, okay, now not knowing what I know now, can I do this again where I'm paired up with a great technology mind and leader and team and bring my business acumen and experience to do this again? And Stuart and team, a lot of them were ex-Flickr. So that was the company that Yahoo had bought. And so our tenures at Yahoo overlapped, although we had not worked together directly. But because of that, our shared network, I was quickly introduced to him. And I met him on a Monday night at the Slack office. And by Friday afternoon, he had called me, offered me a job. And I got my offer letter and signed it on Sunday and gave my 2 weeks notice and then started. So I was really excited about pairing up with a technology mind and a product mind, and also being given a lot of autonomy to do the business parts that I knew well. And, Slack at that point, then I would say benefited from the fact that I was going to make a lot fewer mistakes. And maybe more important than fewer was lower magnitude. I wasn't going to make any really catastrophic things. I knew what to avoid. And on some level, that really guided, especially my early days at Slack.
The people element was a big part of that. The opportunity to put what you had learned into practice was a big part of it. What about the technology and the product itself at that point? Did it excite you? What stage was it in at that point?
You made a comment earlier about whether I knew Slack was going to be big. And I would definitely be lying to everyone here if I said I had any idea of how it was going to play out. But a couple of things were very validating and comforting in the beginning. One, Stuart and our shared network, I think that brings a lot of trust into the system. Even if we didn't work together directly, just in terms of reputation, working styles. I had friends who were, again, similar shared network, who are considering, who are looking at it from an investment perspective and saying, this is actually a very compelling company. And then my wife actually used Slack in its very early stages when it was not even in GA release, because her company, Walmart Labs, was an early, we'll call it beta tester of the product. And she said, we use a lot of these products, and this one I feel is very compelling. I said, wow, great, because I had never used the product at that point. At the end of the day, I wanted to change the industry I was working in. So this was software, this was SaaS, in 2014, which was, still pretty early for that. And working with someone who I just really respected from a product and technology point of view, right? Where I felt like they were excellent at those things. And that's not my specialty by any means, but I knew I was excellent at what I did. And there was this willingness to partner and collaborate and work together on that. So that's really, really big, right? Because, if you get the industry right, that's a huge piece of it. And then, you look at kind of the team, and then I look at the role. And each of those, once I checked each of those boxes, I was like, okay, this really makes a lot of sense for me.
There must be something to mention here as well. Choosing to go into early stage company at that point is not something that everyone would do, right? Tell us a little bit more about the early stages. So you join as employee number 20. What was the team at that point? What were the different functions? How was it like, and what did you build?
I think you have a better appreciation than most, because I usually don't get this question. When I joined Yumi, it was this introduction to the early stage of a startup. Now, it's still different to when you're, say 3 people versus 30 people, but 30 people is still pretty early. A lot of our team was in India and that kind of thing. So there is a lot of work that has to be done, but that's not fit into anyone's job description, right? A lot of it is office work, administrative, especially in a role like mine. And so it became a much more catch-all, when something needed to get done, that it fell to me. And so I was very involved with, on the more interesting side of things, like how sales was going to get built up, how marketing was going to be built up, how we were structuring some of our contracts, how some of our, at the time, ad operations teams were being worked on. The office has sufficient supplies, it's getting cleaned properly, we've got the right admin staff. And so, those are the things that people hear about and they're like, oh, okay, I can deal with that. But it's very humbling to have nobody else to turn to for that. When Stuart and team approached me about Slack, I said, how big is it? They said, well, they just released the product. So it's basically starting off on revenue, although they've got a great start here and they're growing very quickly. And it's 20 people. I said, oh my God, it's smaller than Yumi was. So I knew I would have to relive all of that early kind of pain. But I also appreciated the fact that this was a very unique opportunity with this company, with this team, with this industry, that, all the things that I was looking for, and it resonated for me, and getting the validation from the people that I trusted. So I said, okay, listen, I know what's in store. So I'm going in eyes wide open, and I can handle that. And I know that's not going to be forever, especially the way this thing is growing. And I know that also, if I get in here early, I can make decisions that will help guide the direction and save us a lot of pain in the future. And so that was very exciting for me. And yes, I have my story of where, I did take the trash out, and, in San Francisco, you can get different size trash cans. So I'm calling the people and making sure we've got the right size trash can, and making sure we've got the right amount of Coca-Cola in the office and whatever else is needed. But thankfully that, eventually I was able to hire people to help me with some of those things.
I guess Coca-Cola in the office is important. This is just a fuel. I guess there's a long journey from that point. What are some of the significant, milestones in that journey? Was it sort of building out your team? Was it getting really involved in commercial side of things?
So in the beginning, especially, when I joined, there was, Stuart and Cal. Cal was our CTO and another co-founder. And then they were effectively in charge of, I'll just call R&D in the big broadest sense. And then there was Ali, who was head of what we called customer experience, which was like customer support. And then, there were on the leadership side, then there was me. So if you think about the areas that I described that they covered, I basically covered everything else, at least in some interim capacity. And so I was looking at, for example, sales and account management, and this movement to sales and really enterprise sales was a big one for Slack. We had been, and we continued to be, a very self-service, organically driven, viral adoption type of product. And at the same time, we had large corporate customers asking for a different set of features and considerations and way of buying the product even than our self-service customers of, let's say, SMBs of 10 to 50 employees or in that size range. that was a big transition. And so helping support the company through that by working with Stuart around, well, when is the right time to supplement the leadership team in some of these areas? How do we need to operate the company differently? How do we need to invest differently around some of the product areas, and how would that affect the roadmap and priorities that we need to address? Was an ongoing and pretty significant debate for some time. But I think at some point, we were able to make a decision and move in a direction to support the enterprise, and that became a big growth engine for the company, especially later on. And I think that was, it's just like one of those kind of key moments where I realized that was a lot of years in the making, and having my sort of hand in a lot of different areas gave me a lot of perspective to think about how we could also, invest in that for the organization.
Interesting. And yeah, I mean, that's definitely quite a nuanced topic, deciding where to draw that line, when to call it. And like you said, lots of resources that you have to put in process, and it doesn't happen overnight as well. As you transitioned more and more, I guess, towards the Slack CFO, at that point, how did you look at what your responsibility was? Did it change from the early days? Was it more specialized given that you brought in other leaders? And how would you break down that responsibility into buckets?
That's like a 5-part question. So I will handle the first couple, and then we'll see if you want to just follow up on anything in particular. It's important to, as you mentioned, to highlight, I didn't join Slack as a CFO. And there's 2 comments on that. One, a 20-person company with just starting on revenue doesn't need a CFO. Okay, I think that's important to call out. 2 is I wasn't ready to be CFO. Although if you had asked me in 2014 whether I thought I was ready to be CFO, I would probably tell you I was. And that in and of itself is a whole journey that I, on some one level, basically happened concurrently with the growth of the company. As you mentioned, in 2018, I did become officially the CFO, and then we took the company public in June of 2019. So when I look at what has changed, I will maybe take a step back and think about, okay, well, what is the lead finance/business person doing in the early days? Well, in the beginning, things that are kind of fun topics, buying supplies and all that. That's, you're really just doing pretty simple jobs. There's just a lot of them to do, and there isn't capacity to do them. So I was just effectively an IC, right? An individual contributor doing the tasks that were given to me. But quickly, I had to build out a team, hire people, build out at least the initial scaffoldings of other organizations that were necessarily going to be my specific domain. So that means I needed to become more of a people manager. And I separate that from, so it's the next natural step in evolution in the way we look at leadership. So you've got ICs, you've got people who do things, then you've got managers who are people who are responsible for a collection of doers effectively, but they're still, their main responsibility is the cumulative task before them, right? But it's still a very different job than doing it itself, right? You're doing one-on-ones. You are, thinking more about how to organize and help prioritize and triage things and communicate up and down, et cetera. So it's a very different job than IC. And then lastly, I would say is leadership. So if you go from IC to manager to kind of leader, I think the main point I want people to hear from that is it's a different job. It's not just, oh, I am senior manager 2, then I become senior manager 3, and senior manager 3 equals CXO. That's a common way of people thinking about it, but maybe no one really articulates it that way. It's as if you go to a performance review and you're like, okay, great, you did a great job. Now you're the CXO of your role. And it doesn't make any sense, right? When you hear it that way, a lot of us think, at least I thought that way. And when I look now at that distinction, it took a lot of feedback, took a lot of coaching, and a lot of people just revisiting my assumptions around what I thought I was already doing and what I thought that actually translated to in terms of role. So it's a long way of saying the CFO role itself was first a self-realization around what I was and what I was not ready to do. And then secondly, what that job meant inside of the company. So now I wasn't just doing one-on-ones. Now actually the question I had to answer is, why should people follow me? What am I doing that inspires and gives people motivation and clarity to do this job beyond just the tasks that they have, right? And that is a much higher order than being a great manager. And so I think that's the part that really dovetails with when I think about, okay, well, what is the journey to CFO? It's really this journey of leadership, right? How did I concurrently go through those steps without even realizing it?
No, I really like that. It's true. I think most people may think that it's just the next natural order. It's not really, right? Like there are more layers to it. One you mentioned was leadership, right? Inspiring others to follow you, making the mission clear. Would you also say there's a part of being at the front line of the company, the responsibility to then, figure out what's next, right? How do we see it?
There's a concept that they call first team. Who do you look at as the actual team that you are working with, in the highest priority order? And I would say the biggest distinction for, call it executive level and leadership level, but specifically at the executive leadership level, like we're talking about here, the biggest marker I feel like if people got it right is that their first team shifts from just their functional team to the other executives. That's hard for people to hear because I think all we have known is, well, kind of take care of my own, make sure that, I've got a specialty skill and therefore, but especially in a CFO role, you're not just CFO of the finance team. You're CFO of the company and you're responsible for the capital of the company and the capital allocation of the company and how all of those are getting the appropriate level of investment or not that reflect the company's priorities. And so now I have to be not just great manager with my VP group. No, it's much more about how am I working with the chief revenue officer, chief marketing officer, chief product officer, and so on and so forth, right? To make sure the CEO, to make sure that we are collectively, as you said, in the front, driving the company forward, not just an individual team or department.
Curious to know what was your cadence there, right? With this first team, this executive team, who are the main stakeholders that you interact with?
The number one tool I use to help work that out is my calendar. But let me use it in a reverse example to kind of illustrate the point. Give me anyone's calendar in your organization, and I can almost within, look at 3 months worth of kind of meetings and such, I can almost guess probably within 95% accuracy what their role is, what their level is. And if I'm wrong, well, there's probably a conversation there, maybe on both sides. But the point I'm trying to make there is the time should reflect the priority of that individual. For the first team stuff, my calendar as a CFO is different than my calendar as a VP of finance. My calendar as a CFO now has a lot more all hands meetings. It's got a lot more cross-functional things I'm sitting in on to make sure that I'm sitting on sales things. I've got one-on-ones with the sales leader, one-on-ones with the marketing leader and marketing lead. I'm understanding implications of things to the roadmap that I need to understand. I need to sit with customers to get their feedback. I'm not only doing things that have finance or accounting labeled to them, right? If anything, I have quite few of that because I would expect my leadership team to handle that. So of course I have my one-on-ones with those groups, my kind of key lieutenants in the organization, but that's different. And I'm also spending time with my own, doing all hands meetings for my own organization to make sure that I'm being clear about, well, what's unique about the way the Slack is called the G&A organization is doing what we're doing in the context of the overall Slack organization. And then we also had a group of senior leaders, we called it, create content and time for them so that they could also ask us questions and challenge. That way, when they got questions from their team, it was a unified front. So when you look at that and you look at that calendar, you would say that person's an executive in the company versus, let's say, the most senior finance leader.
A really interesting calendar view, but I think it makes a lot of sense. In terms of the execs that you mentioned, I mean, I do get a very clear sense of the other functional execs that you interact with, right? So be it commercial or product. What about with the CEO? How does that relationship work, right? CFO to CEO.
Hopefully, it went without saying, but the meeting that was always on there for me was with having one-on-ones with the CEO. In fact, for different parts of the time I was at Slack, I had multiple one-on-ones in a given week with Stuart. And it was really important from an alignment perspective. Sometimes I will offer to folks the way to judge if your CFO is doing a good job is to go to their CEO and say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least, 10 being the most, how much do you trust this other person, your CFO? And if you're not saying at least, I'll call it 8.5, that relationship will eventually fail. I also had the benefit, I think fairly unique benefit, of knowing Stuart from the early days. So I wasn't a hired gun or however you want to characterize it. Someone just sort of came from the outside and, try to change things up. I was very much an insider from the beginning, but I did have a on some level outsider perspective, because especially as we wanted to become a public company, there were areas that we needed to change and adapt and evolve, among them like enterprise sales, for example. And I had I would say the good fortune of, I think I asked Stuart this very question. He said 9.5 because 10 feels like that's not right, because that would be perfect. And I said, yeah, I'm also 9.5 because sometimes you kind of piss me off. So I think that element is built in different ways, right? Because, some people, they go for walks together, they spend time together, they go for drinks together. Some people don't drink, so then they do other things. So I think making sure that time is there, but also that there's a understanding. I'm not here to serve you, meaning CFO is not here to serve the CEO. On some level, yes, you're my boss, but I'm here to promote the needs of the company. Now, that seems like I'm trying to make, kind of split hairs a bit, but it's important to have a different perspective, and important, especially as you become a public company, because you're now also representing all these other shareholders. That to me is really the hallmark of a strong CEO CFO relationship, is that trust and that ability to challenge and to create through some of that friction and tension. And Stuart always say this, like, when trust is high, communication can be low. But when trust is low, communication is high. So it's funny because people will say, and you can think about this, when you really trust someone, the amount of times you actually need to check in with them, or the nature of those check-ins, is very efficient. It's like, boom, boom, boom. Oh, I know what you're saying. Okay, boom. Oh, you said this is a problem, but I trust you. You're going to deal with it and come back to me and give me the update. But when it's low, you're like, we're having another one-on-one. Get on the calendar, or we're sitting on this. We're going to spend the next 3 hours working through this. That's a terrible waste of time. Something to think about as you want to give each other feedback around how is this working.
A couple of times now we've sort of mentioned the IPO piece, right? Can you take us through that a little bit?
So I always have to put in a plug for the team. I joined in March of 2014. So we'd just gone GA the month prior. June 2019, we were already trading on the New York Stock Exchange. So just over 5 years, not just having an S1 out there and saying we might go public, we're already trading 5 years from that in a hyper growth environment. It's one of the ways to think about, wow, we did a lot in a short amount of time in a pretty crazy environment, albeit favorable capital environment. The road to IPO, if you will, and we were actually also fortunate to do the direct listing route, which was without raising new primary capital, and sort of the second company after Spotify to do that. So a different listing itself as well. But the journey there was many years, right? And I'm not just talking about, obviously the lifespan of the company. I'm specifically talking about, we made a very concerted, deliberate effort to prepare for the marriage and not the wedding. Really discouraged the team to talk about IPO at all. All we talked about in the company was what we called PCR, which now has a different meaning because of COVID. But PCR for us was public company readiness. And we said, hey, we need to be public company ready, to the point where I would say about a year before we were actually going public, that became a company priority. Okay, what does public company readiness look like for me? Because it wasn't just about getting all the financial stuff in order. We had to be able to run with a rhythm and a predictability and a schedule really was non-negotiable. So there was a lot of elements of that, from your corporate governance and the formation of your board and the committees and how those are handled, to the investor relations function, to your security and compliance and all of those, we'll call them control environments that you have in your company, obviously to the finance team themselves, to the systems that were generating all that. So each of those was a dedicated track, and it really was a cross-functional effort too. This is where having gone through the prior experience was hugely valuable for me, because the culture that I was trying to promote in the company early on was, this is where we're going. That's why we're taking these steps today. And we're not just trying to fix things for the moment. We're going to build some things. Some things we're going to take the shorter route, and that will be shorter, faster. But then a year or two from now, we're going to have to revisit this. And giving that people that clarity of what was coming was really, really valuable, because there were a lot of pain points along the way. Regardless of making the right decision or not, it doesn't mean it's painless. It just means that it's not a huge waste of time. And so that part really, especially I would say the finance and accounting and the G&A organizations, they really came together. IT as an example, really came together to get us to the point where we could function well as a public company beyond the direct listing itself.
I can see sort of that different perspective of someone who has done it before, seen the marriage, kind of share with everyone who's heading there what we need to do or what trade-offs we're making if we need to do something quick today. Certainly lots for us to learn from as well. You had a happy marriage. And Slack later on ended up being acquired. Were you heavily involved in that?
As a company, we were in a healthy place because everyone was on board and it wasn't a finance specific initiative. And so that's why it was about being a public company together. The acquisition is it's a very unique story, I would say, because it happened in the middle of COVID. It was announced in December of 2020. So what was it, 8 or 9 months in to COVID at that point? Or at least what we knew was COVID. So everyone was working remotely. So this was, I think the second largest software deal ever done completely remotely without any physical meetings, which is sort of mind blowing if you think about the scale and the magnitude of what we're talking about. Stuart was working with Brett Taylor at the time, who was one of the senior leaders at Salesforce, and really came up with this vision of how sort of the combined forces and strengths of the respective organizations would lead to a more powerful combination. And I really believe that. I think that continues to play out today in terms of the expertise of Slack's product and consumer and user kind of understanding with the strong go-to-market capabilities of Salesforce is really continuing to play out. And my involvement there was more to make sure that this happened, right? At that point, this is one of those things where it's really how founders and how, the early leaders, if they don't believe in the combined vision, then they won't transact on this kind of thing. Stuart wouldn't have sold. We look at that and we look at the combined vision. That's really what brought this thing together. And then ultimately, around there are the details, if you will, around the price and the structure of the deal and whatnot. And that all got worked out over time. And then it was a pretty, intensive due diligence process working with regulators, again, all remotely, with legal, with different compliance matters. And we were able to get that done. And so that deal officially was closed in July of 2021. And that was right around the time that I moved to Singapore.
Cool. And maybe bringing things a little closer to home and to now, you've made this move to Singapore. You're doing a little bit of work within the startup space here as well, whether it's from an investment angle or from a coaching angle. Would you tell us a little bit more about that transition as well? Like, why you came here and what you're looking, or what keeps you busy these days?
Why I came here, I will keep fairly brief. A lot of it is a function of the timing. So as Slack was completing the sale to Salesforce, it presented a natural transition point for me. And I was alluding to earlier, I spoke to my wife about potentially moving abroad as a transition, as a way to, take advantage of that transition. She was open to it. And, in the world of COVID, in a world where we were looking for an English speaking country that we thought was going to be good for our family and had generally a warmer climate, you really only had Singapore, to be honest, and that would let us in because we were able to take advantage of a visa situation that worked out for us. So since then, I've been very excited to be here. It's been wonderful for our family. My kids are really enjoying their school. My wife is very happy here. There are a lot of things about the way the government helps run the society and the social values that people collectively subscribe to, even if you don't always agree with it. A unity that's very important. And then we're Asian American, so cuisine and kind of it's such a big part of your culture, your day to day is something that was very favorable for us. But now in terms of the work, I'm no longer doing full time CFO work. I am helping out on a couple boards. One is Credivo, which focuses in Indonesia in the fintech space. One is an earlier stage company called UNL, and I call them Location Technology. And then I've been working with Shopback on some coaching and some executive support and working with different parts of the organization. So but at the same time, I'm just generally open to supporting this community in Singapore, meaning the startup and tech community. There's just a lot here where I realize it's very early stage, earlier stage than what I've seen. Not many companies have gone public here, and those that have are pretty unique in terms of their offerings. And so how can we raise and support this next generation of leaders and companies so that in 3 to 5 years time, you've got a really looming set of public companies or companies at scale that can then further bring on the generation after that. So I feel like that's Singapore and Southeast Asia is really on the cusp of that beginning of that virtuous cycle, but it will still take some time.
It's a bit of something that you feel like, I mean, it's driven a bit by passion, right? And obviously your expertise in the space. Do you see a lot of potential? Is maybe the question after, I guess you've been here for 2 years now?
Absolutely see a lot of potential. There are some structural factors that I think are not clear to me how they will exactly play out. On the one hand, I think what's very interesting is that at least one example I saw is some more of this kind of regional partnership, right? So there's less, for example, on the payment side, less cross-border friction than there used to be. And that's moving in the right direction. I think now you can do like the pay now equivalent in all the different currencies in the region. It's like 6 or 7 countries, something like that. That's amazing to see, to be able to really view this as a regional entity. The more things go in that direction and the more ability to treat this as a region, I think it's going to be good for the overall market and TAM opportunity. The more it becomes kind of everyone for themselves and only sort of national champion type of thinking, whether that's in Indo or Thailand or Vietnam, then I think that's a bit more limiting, right? Because I think what this area hasn't really tapped into yet is the culture of sharing, the culture of collaboration outside of your company. I'm not talking about business and commercial partnerships. I'm just talking about shared interests, people with the nature to kind of pay it forward or to support that what you're doing is supporting the greater good of this ecosystem. And what I found so far is that it's a bit still to zero-sum thinking. When I'm in the Valley, or when I was in the Valley, it was very common for CFOs of other software companies in similar spaces as Slack to be willing to talk to me about things that they were going through, and vice versa if they reached out to me, or people on my team and their team, so we could share best practices. I think if I suggested that as something here, people would be very, very skeptical and maybe a bit paranoid around what to share. What is the point of this? What am I going to get out of it? Versus the nature of the network is to make the velocity of connection faster. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's evenly distributed, but in the course of it, it's more of a rising tide lifts all boats dynamic, right? That's what I feel like Singapore, which has such a unique position in this region, can really aspire to. And then the next part is helping. I think tech startups can really help with this kind of deprogramming I was speaking to, because I speak to a lot of investors and tech executives here, and how people define success and what they're looking for in a job. Now, forget about tech for a second, but just broadly, is still quite narrow. And often influenced by parents and the generation before. And again, all understandable. Like I was saying, I can relate to a lot of that. But how do we accelerate some of that development and openness to challenge that? Because you've got so many smart, hardworking people, but they're all somewhat trapped by this very narrow set of expectations around what success looks like and can be defined as, which, man, if that is really unleashed and untapped, what is the potential of just this market, and then really how that spills over into other markets.
Amazing. I think that's a really inspiring place to wrap things up. Lots of food for thought. I think we talked about some really great topics. I mean, obviously, thank you so much for sharing about your journey. That was amazingly insightful, and how we're looking into untapped future potential of this region, which I think we're definitely happy that folks like you, and I guess the Singapore government would be really happy to know they're attracting talent to kind of boost the ecosystem as a whole. So yeah, thank you so much for coming down. It was a real pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.